Hello, everyone. I realize it has been a while since I have gone live, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to talk about small government legislation that is making its way through the states. We're all aware of the big infrastructure bill that's making its way through Congress right now, the whole child care's infrastructure, iced coffee is infrastructure bill. But I just wanted to talk about some bills that are being passed through these state legislatures with two focuses: death penalty abolition and marijuana legalization. And before I mention that, I think we're all aware of the news that Derek Chauvin has been convicted of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. And I have to admit, I was not expecting a conviction just because I'm aware of so many cases where when an officer did something wrong, for whatever reason, like whatever it was, there was reasonable doubt or whether the prosecution may not have done a good job, they always seem to end the same way, which is an acquittal for one reason or another. And to me, the case that is emblematic of this was Philando Castile, where there was footage of the officer unnecessarily killing him, and despite that video evidence, the jury ultimately acquitted the officer. And so I just assumed that this case would end just like all the others, and I'm glad that it didn't, because it's a confirmation that we all saw that we're not crazy, and that we saw what we all think we saw, which was an officer murdering a civilian. And I think that people say that there are people on the right who are freaking out about this there was undue pressure on the jurors, and I don't think there's any evidence of that. Although maybe the defense will have a case on appeal. We'll have to see about that. But there are also those who are saying on the other side that this is not the system working, and I could not disagree more. This was the system working, and it's a system that too often does not work. And so I think that we have to look at it in that context, where unusually enough, when an officer committed a crime, his fellow officers testified against him. There was video evidence, and the jury ultimately decided to convict him. And that to me is evidence of the system working, when too often it doesn't. So I think we need to recognize it again in that light. And so I disagree with the extremes on both sides of the aisle when it comes to this case. And I'm hopeful that there will be more instances of it whenever something wrong happens that is committed by a police officer, that there will be more accountability. I think that the trust in police officers has been eroded, and I think that ultimately puts communities at risk. And the answer is not defund the police or anything like that. The answer is rebuilding trust. And I think that there are ways to do that. One way I think would be to abolish qualified immunity, which in practice basically allows any officer who commits a crime to get off the hook. And I think that we need to invest more in communities, and we need to pursue all the reasonable based solutions, not the slogans like defund the police or ACAB. I think that there are real solutions that have been proposed, and I want there to be a more national debate about those proposals and not the catchy slogans, because this is about people's lives, and I think it deserves more than just catchy slogans like ACAB and all of that. And I'm glad that, but again, I'm glad that we seem to be moving in the right direction, when for too long the system is imperfect and it can stubbornly resist change. But I believe that it ultimately, at the end of the day, the right thing will be done. And I think that what happened last night with the conviction of Derek Chauvin, I think, is just one of what will be many examples of that. Anyway, going from the issue of policing to the death penalty, we're all aware of the decision by Virginia to abolish the death penalty, which is amazing, because historically, I believe it was the second largest user of the death penalty, just behind Texas. And per capita, it may have very well been the biggest user of the death penalty. And I think it's just a bigger part of Virginia's political transformation. Virginia was once a solidly conservative state, and it was one of the Jim Crow states, and it was at one time, I think, one of the most Republican states in the entire South. It was the only Confederates. It was the only Southern state, unless you count Oklahoma as a Southern state. It was the only Southern state that voted for Gerald Ford over Jimmy Carter in 1976. And so this is how historically rock-ribbed Republican this state once was. And the fact that Democrats are back in power is indicative of a political transformation that's powered, I think, in part by the Northern Virginia suburbs, as well as the growth of Richmond and places like that. And the Democrats that have been elected to power in Virginia are very different from the ones that governed it, even under Gene Wilder in the 1990s. And that is what allowed for death penalty abolition to pass in Virginia. And it's ironic that Virginia beat California to abolishing the death penalty, because California, Oregon, those states, they still have capital punishment. So it is just breathtaking to see Virginia join the 23 states that have abolished the death penalty. And it's not just Virginia. A lesser known measure that was being debated in Montana would have reinstated, not formally reinstated, but effectively, because Montana hasn't had an execution since 2006. They actually, I don't believe, have handed down a single death sentence in the 21st century. There's only 2 people left on death row. And since 2015, a ruling by the state courts has actually invalidated the specific lethal injection protocol. I believe that requires a fast-acting substance. But what Republicans wanted to do this year, especially now that they regained a trifecta in the state last year, was that they wanted to basically change the law to allow the state to use any substance that can cause a death. And this passed the state house, but just last week, it sounds like the state Senate voted down the measure and it will not be enacted. So there have been, I think, other measures that have passed this year, like I think South Carolina, I believe, voted to reinstate the electric chair. So in a sense, that's really one of the biggest policy legislative victories for death penalty proponents since the 90s, when New York was the most recent state to have formally reinstated capital punishment, although it would get struck down by the courts just less than a decade later. But since it's worth noting that since the 1990s, since in the 21st century, not a single state has formally reintroduced the death penalty. And the only thing that has really come close to that was decisions by states in the last 10 years, that already had the death penalty, but for whatever reason were not conducting executions, to pass legislation, reintroducing measures other than lethal injection that basically cleared an obstacle. It's a legislative move to clear an obstacle to executions, but it's not a formal reintroduction. So in a sense, these moves have been some of the biggest policy victories for proponents of the death penalty since the 1990s. Now, I've made my position on the death penalty, I think, quite clear, which is that I view it the same way as I do abortion, and I view it the same way as I do assisted suicide, which is it's the state sanctioning the death of a person, which I don't believe the state should do. So it's great that I think states are moving towards abolishing capital punishment, but we are not done yet, because Nevada is currently debating a measure. It's passed the state house. It needs to see a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee and the state Senate before being signed by the governor. And it's not entirely clear that it'll clear those hurdles, but it has passed the assembly. So Nevada might be the second state this year to formally abolish capital punishment. Keep in mind, it has not had an execution since 2006, but I think it has about a few dozen people on death row. It's not entirely clear that it'll make it through the state Senate. I think the Senate the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Majority Leader, who are both Democrats, they seem a bit iffy about the proposal. So, so it might get to a committee vote. It might pass the state senate, but the governor has also said he's not sure if he'll sign it. So it remains to be seen whether or not Nevada will actually accomplish the abolition of the death penalty. If you want to follow that bill along, I believe it's called AB 395. I have been following it. There's the Nevada Independent, my friend Tabitha Muller has been covering the legislative session, and so hopefully we'll see more information about this repeal effort in Nevada. One thing to understand is that there are some deadlines coming up. I believe Friday, May 14th, is when the Nevada State Senate Judiciary Committee has to get the bill out of the committee, and then the following week on May 21st, it has to pass the state Senate. Yesterday was an important day because it was crossover day in Nevada, so any measure has to pass out of one legislature in order to stay alive in the other one. So it did pass the assembly. So we'll see. We will see in a few weeks from now whether or not this measure will get a committee hearing and whether it'll get a vote. I'm hopeful that it will, but we will have to see where this goes. Anyway, moving on to marijuana. There's been a flurry of bills that have been proposed. As we probably all know, in the last election last year, Montana, Arizona, New Jersey all voted to legalize recreational marijuana. And Mississippi also voted to legalize, Mississippi and South Dakota both legalized medicinal marijuana. South Dakota also voted to legalize recreational marijuana, but that measure is currently awaiting its fate by the state Supreme Court. A lower judge has actually struck down the measure under the state constitution. So it's quite possible that the courts might actually have thwarted this proposal. We're going to hear a ruling from the state Supreme Court eventually. So it's not entirely clear where recreational marijuana is going to end up in South Dakota, whether or not they're going to have another referendum on it. But anyway, this year alone, the legislatures in New York, New Mexico, and Virginia, again, Virginia, have also voted to legalize recreational marijuana via their state legislatures, which is Virginia is the first state in the South, basically, to both abolish the death penalty and to legalize recreational marijuana. So that is big. And while Democrats have trifectas in places like Maryland and Hawaii, in those states, they were not able to get recreational marijuana passed. So that is something important to keep in mind, is that even in places where Democrats have control, it's not necessarily going to result in marijuana being legalized. And Republicans are also proposing measures to legalize marijuana themselves in various states. Like the proposal in New Mexico, there was a competing proposal in New Mexico by a Republican that would have been more market oriented, less racial justice oriented, which, in my opinion, I think it's better to have the private sector organize the marijuana market. And I also think that, while there's a case to be made for prioritizing, communities that have been hit by the war on drugs, I think that ultimately that measure is divisive, and I think it's driving away people who would otherwise support legalization. I do support expunging prior convictions for whatever is being legalized, but I think that the prioritizing of certain communities might be a more divisive measure, and if it's prioritized based on race, that would be unconstitutional. So, that is something to keep in mind with some of these measures, is that Democrats are going bold, and Republicans are also moving towards, being open towards legalizing marijuana. There was measures that actually passed in South Dakota and North Dakota. Measures to legalize marijuana passed one house, one chamber in each of those states. I believe the state house in North Dakota, the state senate in South Dakota, and that didn't pass the other house. I think there was a measure that was being proposed in Kansas that might have expanded the state's medical marijuana program. I don't think it ultimately succeeded, but it's important to keep in mind that in places like Maryland and Hawaii, it's not necessarily going to get done. And, Maryland, certainly, because they actually have a Republican governor who I don't think supports legalization. New Hampshire is also a social liberal state, but I think there's a bit less openness because of the opioid epidemic in New Hampshire. And Republicans just retook control of the state legislature last year, so it's unlikely that they'll be able to, even if they can get it past the state legislature. I don't think Governor Sununu is supportive of the idea of legalizing recreational marijuana. So New Hampshire doesn't seem like it's going to. Well, there was no legislation being advanced. But we will get to New Hampshire in just a second, because I want to talk a bit more, because there's still a couple states that are actually, there are measures that are still alive and could very well pass. We are not done yet, folks. There are bills in Connecticut, in Rhode Island, and in Delaware that are being actively debated, that could legalize recreational marijuana in those states. Minnesota is also debating a bill, but the Democrats did not succeed in retaking control of the state Senate in that state. So, excuse me, it's unclear whether or not they'll be able to get that measure passed. So, but that's going to be worth keeping an eye on. The end of the session in Minnesota is actually coming up next month, and the state Democrats in the state house have said they'll vote on it then. There's some talk about whether or not Republicans, if they're opposed to the measure, will at least allow a referendum on it. I don't think that's likely to happen, but it'll be worth keeping an eye on. But again, all the states like Minnesota, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Delaware still have measures that are being debated that could legalize recreational marijuana in those states. Now, I mentioned New Hampshire because they are actively debating a bill that would institute right to work in New Hampshire. I do not know what has happened to that bill, and I will have to cover that in a later episode. But in Montana, a similar measure was defeated that would have adopted right to work legislation. I'll have to admit that I'm not the biggest fan of unions. I actually am a member of a union right now, and I have to admit I'm not the biggest fan, just because, it's not necessarily, based on collective bargaining aspect. Where I live, unions are allowed to spend mandatory union dues on political advocacy, and very often the Canadian, they take positions which I don't agree with. The Canadian Union for Public Employees, for instance, has supported boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, something which I am vehemently opposed to. And I just don't think that my union dues should be spent on that purpose. I think that if they want to, they can get people to donate to that cause. But I should not have to have my union dues spent on that purpose. I think that in states that do have strong union laws in the U.S., I think there at least is some provision that says that union dues can only be spent on collective bargaining, whereas in Canada, there is no such distinction made between collective bargaining and political advocacy. And that I think is a real problem, and it's pretty much the reason why I am not the biggest fan of unions, and why I've sort of tended towards supporting right to work legislation. But the one in New Hampshire, I don't know what's happened to it. The one in Montana has been defeated, so I'll have to cover that in a later episode. But I think it's just circling back to the death penalty, because there's been some executive action in the past few months. Arizona, I think, had been under a moratorium imposed by the Attorney General that was because of their inability to find drugs to use for lethal injection. Well, the Attorney General last month basically cleared the way for executions to restart. It is worth noting, I forgot to mention this earlier, that there has not been a state execution since July of last year. And I believe that is the longest period that there has not been an execution, I believe, since the 1970s. So that is worth noting, that even in states that that have not formally abolished the death penalty, there are also states like Pennsylvania, Oregon, and California, where the governors have proposed moratoriums. States where the courts have imposed moratoriums, like Montana and Kentucky. I believe North Carolina, the state board of physicians has basically blocked executions in that state, and there's no sign of them resuming anytime soon. But it's also worth noting that really, I think that my guest Hannah Cox was also talking about this, that even in states that have not formally abolished death penalty and don't have any sort of moratorium, the executions are going down. Like Indiana, Nevada, Utah, Louisiana, a lot of these states have actually not had an execution in over 10 years. And even in Texas last year had only 3 executions. So the number of executions overall in the United States really is decreasing. Aside from that spate of federal executions that occurred at the end of the Trump administration, on the state level, there really hasn't been any executions in the last really in the last 9 months, and that could continue for a while. So, and it's also important to remember that the majority of the world's executions are taking place in mainland China. So, and as a proportion of the world, and really in terms of hard numbers, the United States has really seen the death penalty really fall out of use. As I mentioned before, Montana has only 2 people left on death row. They have not handed down a single death sentence in the 21st century. Kansas reintroduced the death penalty in 1994, but have never used it. Wyoming has only had 1 execution since reintroducing it in 1977. It was in 1992. And they actually have no one on death row at the moment. They are the only death penalty state without anyone on death row currently. South Dakota has had recent executions, but there's only 1 person left on death row. So, I could go on and on and on. Indiana has only 8 people. Idaho has only 8 people. Mississippi is having trouble, carrying out executions because they don't fund their public attorneys well enough in some poor counties. So, the death sentences get overturned because the Fifth Amendment and Sixth Amendment are violated because of the lack of counsel. So, in state after state, I think that the capital punishment really is falling out of favor. And I think it is only a matter of time before every state comes around to abolishing it. As for marijuana, I think that's probably going to take a bit longer. I think that, there is still some resistance to the idea, as there is, by the way, with the death penalty. Still to this day, a majority of Americans say they support capital punishment, but I believe the numbers, will come back down, especially if and when this recent spate in murders has abated. And I think, there's a good chance that it could soon. At least I'm hopeful that it will. But what's notable is that even with this recent spate of homicides that have taken place in the last year or so, death penalty support has not gone back up. It's really stayed steady. So people, I think, are coming around to the idea that capital punishment doesn't work. It's costly. It doesn't deter crime. And in my opinion, it's something the state should not be doing. So I think it's only a matter of time before every state, if not formally abolishing the death penalty, I think that will eventually happen. But if not formally, then functionally, because it's falling out of use. I think especially younger conservatives are recognizing that it's an expensive, wrong thing, and it just doesn't work. And I think younger people who are coming into law, coming into public office, from all sides, both Republicans and Democrats, I think are coming around to this idea. And Wyoming, for example, voted down a measure to abolish death penalty. They might take it up again in 2023. But I think that is something that could very well be the case, is that every state does away with capital punishment, sometime in the next few decades. As for marijuana, I think that there might be more of a resistance to that. It doesn't exactly help that the current president does not support legalizing marijuana. He might very well support removing it from the Controlled Substances Act, but he himself does not support legalizing. He does support abolishing the death penalty, and so I think that there's momentum. I think the momentum is on the side of those who want to abolish capital punishment, even with the recent spate of murders that have taken place. And to me, that is a really encouraging sign, that in spite of everything, that at least in the areas of marijuana and death penalty abolition, I think that more and more people are coming around to embracing small government, at least in these 2 areas. And I hope that limited government, catches on in some other areas. But this is certainly progress that we have been seeing in just the last few months. Anyway, it was really great to stream. I really hope to get to stream a bit more often. I'm a little bit less busy these days, so we'll see what happens. But hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys another time.